When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not out of fear of being caught, but because I knew what he was about to find. Those messages. The ones I'd carelessly forgotten to delete. I reached for the phone instinctively, but he pulled back, his eyes locked on the screen, flipping through message after message with a growing intensity that made my skin crawl. I watched his expression shift, every muscle in his face contorting with the unraveling of our life together, and I knew he was seconds away from the one message. The one that would shatter everything. The one that would either explain everything or ruin it beyond repair. My phone buzzed suddenly in his hand. A new notification lit up the screen, and he froze, his grip tightening. I saw the name flash before he could hide it from me. His face went pale, his jaw clenched so hard I could hear the quiet grind of his teeth. I bit the inside of my cheek, a nervous habit I'd carried since I was a child. The taste of blood didn't distract me. Nothing could. His breathing grew heavier, louder, echoing in the space between us like a countdown to disaster. This was it. The moment I had dreaded for weeks, maybe months. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that changed everything. And now, I didn't know what would happen next. But let me tell you how it all started. Before I share the secret I tried to bury so carefully for so long, write in the comments what city you're watching this from, and tell me, have you ever kept a secret so heavy that it almost broke you? I didn't cheat because I wanted to. I didn't even know I was capable of something like that. My life was routine, structured, safe. It was everything I had once hoped for, and nothing I truly needed anymore. That Monday had been like so many others. I arrived early at the office, coffee in hand, hair still slightly damp from the rushed morning shower. My desk was already stacked with papers and post-it notes. The team group chat buzzed with updates, requests, reminders. There was a crisis with one of our vendors, and our big presentation scheduled for Friday was hanging by a thread. As usual, I was the one expected to hold it all together. My husband had texted me earlier, *, don't forget we're visiting my mother tonight. *, I had forgotten. Again. A sharp twist of guilt curled in my stomach. I replied quickly, I'll try to be home by 7, knowing full well that wouldn't happen. The tone of his response, just a single thumbs up, landed like a slap. Cold. Final. By noon, I had already mediated 2 calls, rewritten the pitch deck, and skipped lunch. I caught my reflection in the dark window of the conference room, a tired face, framed by a blouse I didn't remember buying. There was no sparkle. No softness. Just functionality. Then he walked in. My boss. He wasn't particularly handsome. But there was something about him, sharp, self-assured, calm under pressure. He glanced at the projector, sighed lightly, and said, if this works on Friday, it'll be because of you. It wasn't a compliment. It was a simple statement. But I hadn't heard anything like that in years, maybe. Not from someone who looked me in the eye while saying it. I didn't smile. I just nodded and got back to work. But something about the moment lingered like the aftertaste of strong coffee, bitter, but addictive. When the day finally ended, I drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. The engine hummed, and the city rolled past my windows like a slideshow I wasn't interested in watching. At red lights, I scrolled through messages, half hoping my husband would check in. He didn't. Home was dark. His car was in the driveway, but he wasn't in the kitchen. I found him in the garage, hunched over something mechanical and greasy. He looked up and said, "You ate already?" That was it. That was the entirety of our evening conversation. I showered, changed into soft pajamas, and sat on the edge of the bed. My body ached in that quiet, invisible way. The way only exhaustion mixed with a deep emotional vacancy can make you ache. I checked my email one last time before bed. There it was, the message from him. The subject line read, *, you saved the day again. *. The body was short. *, I don't know how you manage all of this. Just wanted to say thank you. You're holding this place together. *. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed just doing my job and deleted it. Then typed that means a lot and deleted that, too. In the end, I just stared at the screen until it dimmed and my reflection looked back at me again. I closed the laptop. Beside me, my husband snored faintly. One hand curled around the edge of the blanket like a child clinging to safety. I watched him sleep and I felt nothing. Not love, not hate. Just absence. Like we were two strangers who had once shared a great adventure, and now sat quietly at the end of it, pretending it hadn't already ended. I turned off the light. That night, I dreamed about driving. The road was long and empty, the sky wide and silver. In the dream, I missed every exit, but I didn't care. I just kept going. Alone. When I woke up, the bed beside me was empty. The smell of coffee drifted in from the kitchen. He was there, as always, doing what he always did. But I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. Something had shifted. And even if no one else could see it, I could feel the fault line running right through me. I got dressed deliberately. Chose a blouse I hadn't worn in months. One that made me feel present. Not beautiful. Just visible. As I grabbed my keys, I caught his eye. He looked at me for a second too long, then said, "You're early." I said nothing. Just nodded and walked out. I didn't cheat because I wanted to. I cheated because I had already disappeared. And someone unexpected, noticed I was still there. The morning sun hit differently that day, not brighter, not warmer, just sharper somehow. Like everything was outlined more clearly, as if even the air had stopped pretending. I got to the office early again, beating even the janitorial staff. The building felt hollow without voices or footsteps. I liked it that way. The silence made room for thoughts I could no longer push aside. I poured myself stale coffee from yesterday's pot, not bothering to brew fresh. The bitterness matched the dull edge inside me. As I stirred in powdered creamer, I caught my reflection in the glass of the break room door. Lipstick slightly smudged, hair too neat to be effortless is trying, but not quite succeeding. That was me now. A woman trying to exist between the pages of someone else's story. He walked in half an hour later. Just as I was settling behind my desk, pretending to go over slides for the upcoming trip, he passed my door without looking in. But something shifted in my chest when I heard his steps. Not nerves, exactly, more like recognition. Like your body remembering someone it used to trust. The day unfolded under pressure. We had back-to-back calls, 2 client emergencies, and a change in venue for the Friday meeting. He handled it all with that unnerving calm of his, delegating, deciding, pausing only to sip espresso in silence. I followed orders, filled in gaps, caught errors before they could turn into problems. We worked like two halves of a well-oiled machine. Efficient. Predictable. Until the hallway. It was late afternoon, and I was returning from the print room when we crossed paths. Neither of us spoke. But his hand brushed mine, accidental, I told myself, and we both paused, just slightly. Enough to feel the breath between us change. Enough to feel the unsaid words crowding the narrow space. I didn't look back. I kept walking. But I carried that touch with me. Later that day, as the office began to empty, he called me into the conference room. I hesitated for a moment, then entered. He stood at the far end, hands in his pockets, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the slow-fading light of early evening. He didn't say anything at first. Just handed me a folder. I took it. Our fingers didn't touch this time, but I felt them want to. "This is the updated pitch deck," he said, his voice steady, neutral. "We'll need to revise slide 16. I nodded, pretending to scan the contents. My hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. From awareness. He continued, softer now, "You've done more than anyone else on this team. Just, in case I haven't said that." The weight of those words sat somewhere in my spine. I hadn't realized how much I craved acknowledgement until it came from him. And maybe that was the most dangerous part of all. Outside the glass doors, the office was nearly deserted. The world had already moved on to dinner plans and traffic jams. But we were still there, two people suspended in a moment that wasn't meant to exist. He reached for the deck again, our hands brushing one more time, and that's when it happened. We kissed. I don't know who leaned in first. Maybe we both did. Maybe we met halfway out of instinct or need or some silent agreement forged over weeks of glances and shared silence. It wasn't long. It wasn't planned. But it was real. We kissed. Then, almost as quickly, we pulled away. Breathless. Embarrassed. Afraid. I looked down, adjusting my sleeves like it might fix something. He rubbed the back of his neck, his posture suddenly more guarded. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt full, my thoughts too scattered to arrange into words. I left the room without looking back. In the elevator, my heart was still pounding. I kept my eyes fixed on the panel of buttons, willing the floor numbers to climb faster. My lips still tingled, not from the contact, but from the meaning behind it. It wasn't lust. It wasn't even romance. It was the sound of a door opening inside me, a door I hadn't realized had been locked for years. Driving home, I kept replaying it. Not the kiss itself, but the moment after. The guilt didn't come right away. Instead, there was an echo of warmth, like sunlight in a cold room. At home, my husband was finishing dinner. Chicken, steamed vegetables, the same meal we'd had every Monday for a year. He smiled when I walked in. A real smile. I returned it, weakly. We ate in silence. Afterwards, I offered to do the dishes, though I usually never did. He shrugged and turned on the TV. I scrubbed each plate too hard, as if trying to erase something invisible from my hands. In bed that night, he turned to me, touched my shoulder. Just lightly. Like he used to, back when our connection was unspoken and easy. I didn't recoil, but I didn't move closer either. He sighed and rolled over. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. The darkness offered no clarity. Only more questions. Was it the kiss that changed things? Or just the acknowledgement that I could be kissed at all? The next morning, I avoided mirrors. I got dressed mechanically, chose a neutral outfit, applied minimal makeup. I told myself nothing had happened. Not really. That denial would be my protection. At work, we didn't speak of it. We interacted as usual, professional, courteous, distant. If anyone noticed anything different, they didn't say. But I noticed. I noticed how my hands trembled slightly when he entered a room. How his voice seemed to slow when he addressed me. How we both started choosing opposite sides of meeting tables. That kiss had tilted the ground beneath us. And whether we admitted it or not, neither of us was standing on solid earth anymore. The days that followed were a blur, but not the kind where time slips away unnoticed. No, these days dragged. Each hour carried its own weight, as if everything around me had suddenly become heavier, conversations, glances, even silence. Especially silence. It pressed against my chest in elevators, in meetings, in the still moments between emails. I threw myself into work. That was my shield. Spreadsheets, scheduling, endless logistics, tasks that required precision but no emotion. I made myself indispensable, as if productivity could silence the voice in my head reminding me of what I'd allowed to happen. And yet, no matter how busy I stayed, that moment returned. In quiet flashes. The touch, the pause, the undeniable truth that we had crossed a line. He avoided me at first. Not obviously, he was too controlled for that, but the change was there. He stopped dropping by my desk. Our conversations stayed strictly professional. In meetings, he directed questions to the room rather than looking at me. Others might not have noticed, but I did. And that strange sense of disappointment surprised me. I wasn't supposed to want more. That wasn't the point. This wasn't some schoolgirl crush. It was something else. A recognition. Of being seen, acknowledged, desired. I had not felt like a woman in years. I had felt like a role, wife, manager, support system. Never the subject. Always the context. One afternoon, I saw him laughing with one of the interns in the hallway. The intern, young, pretty, confident, tossed her hair as she handed him a printed agenda. He smiled. Not flirtatiously, just warmly. And for reasons I couldn't explain, my chest tightened. That night, I stood in front of my closet longer than usual. I ran my fingers over fabric I hadn't touched in months, silk blouses, dresses with fitted waists, shoes with too high a heel for comfort. I didn't wear them. I just looked at them, remembering a time when I used to dress for possibility. These days, I dressed for invisibility. My husband noticed none of this. Or, if he did, he said nothing. We lived like parallel lines, close, but never intersecting. He asked how work was, I said fine. I asked if he wanted anything from the grocery store, he shook his head. We shared space, shared meals, even shared a bed. But intimacy had long since evaporated into habit. The following Monday, we had a late meeting scheduled, an emergency review of the revised project plan. Most of the team had gone home, but he and I stayed behind. At first, it was tense. We sat on opposite sides of the table, papers spread out like a barrier between us. I focused on notes, refused to meet his eyes. But eventually, the formality cracked. He leaned back, arms crossed. Are we going to pretend none of it happened? I didn't look up. My voice was quiet. It didn't mean anything. Didn't it? He asked. Not challenging, just curious. I closed the folder in front of me. We were tired. Stressed. It was a moment. He said nothing. Just nodded once, slowly. Then he stood and walked to the window, the city lights casting soft reflections across his face. I've never been good at lines, he said finally. I always think they're clearer than they are. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because what was I supposed to say? That I'd been thinking about that kiss too? That I caught myself wondering what it meant, what I meant? I wasn't ready for that truth. Not even inside my own head. We left separately that evening, as we always did. But something had shifted again. Not back to before, but not quite forward either. Like we were caught in a holding pattern, circling around something neither of us was ready to name. The next day, my husband brought home flowers. It wasn't an anniversary or a special occasion. He just handed them to me with a soft, almost sheepish smile. Saw these and thought of you, he said. I thanked him, smiled, put them in water. But I didn't feel anything. No warmth. No guilt. Just confusion. I wondered why now. Why flowers, after so long? Was it some subconscious recognition that I had drifted away? Later, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, flowers in one hand, grocery bag in the other. I looked composed. Polished. The kind of woman who had her life together. But inside, I felt fractured. Not broken, just split between the life I was supposed to want and the one I secretly longed for. That week continued in a strange equilibrium. He and I worked closely on the presentation, but carefully. Every exchange was precise, measured. Yet the air between us remained charged, even in silence. One afternoon, while reviewing slides, our hands brushed again. This time, I didn't flinch. Neither did he. But we didn't acknowledge it either. We just kept talking, eyes fixed on the screen, pretending everything was exactly as it should be. But it wasn't. And the weight of that unspoken truth grew heavier with every passing day. The following week brought with it a storm of logistics, deadlines, and unpredictable requests. We were approaching the most critical phase of the project, an out-of-town client presentation that had to land perfectly. Everyone on the team felt the pressure, and that pressure kept us from asking too many questions or lingering too long in anyone's personal space. But beneath that momentum, something quieter unfolded. We were assigned to travel together. It wasn't intentional, it just made the most sense. The client expected both of us, and our roles were too integrated to separate. I told myself that. I told myself a lot of things. That we'd be professional. That it didn't mean anything. That nothing would happen. Still, when I packed my bag that night, I lingered over small choices. I swapped one blouse for another, added a pair of heels I hadn't worn in a year. I told myself it was about confidence. Presentation. But it wasn't just that. My husband asked where I was going, he'd forgotten. Again. When I reminded him, he nodded absently, then asked if I had the keys to the shed. I said yes, even though I didn't. He didn't notice. The next morning, we left just after sunrise. The road was long, cutting through stretches of farmland and sleepy towns. We talked mostly about the project, but the pauses between topics grew longer. At one point, he asked if I liked long drives. I said yes, and he smiled, then returned his eyes to the road. It was a small moment. But it stayed with me. The hotel was modest but modern, just outside the city. Separate rooms, of course. I felt a small sense of relief when I saw the hallway branching off in two directions, his room to the left, mine to the right. It gave us distance. Boundaries. That evening, after the welcome dinner with the client's team, we walked back together. The air was brisk, and I pulled my coat tighter around me. He offered me his scarf, I declined. But the gesture stayed with me longer than the chill. Back in my room, I peeled off my dress clothes and stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair out slowly. My skin looked tired, yes, but also alive. There was color in my cheeks, something present in my eyes that hadn't been there in months. I lay awake for hours. Not anxious, exactly. Just aware. Of my body. Of time. Of possibility. The next day, we arrived early at the client's office and delivered the presentation. It went flawlessly. I could feel it in the energy of the room, the way they nodded, the way they leaned in. At one point, when I was outlining our proposed strategy, I caught his gaze from across the table. He gave the smallest nod. Approval. Reassurance. Something more. Afterward, the client insisted we celebrate over lunch. It turned into a drawn-out affair, complete with toasts and small talk and promises of future collaboration. We were both exhausted by the time we returned to the hotel. I didn't go straight to my room. I lingered in the lobby, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts just yet. He found me there. "Walk with me," he asked. We didn't go far, just a small path behind the hotel, leading toward a quiet overlook. The city lights sparkled in the distance, but here it was still. Empty. Peaceful. We stood side by side for a while, not speaking. Then he said, "You carried us today. I hope you know that." "I just did what I always do," I replied, though my voice sounded more vulnerable than I intended. He looked at me. Not like a colleague. Not even like a friend. Just like a man seeing a woman. "I don't want to make this harder for you," he said, his voice low. "I know you have your life. Your marriage. I'm not trying to interfere." "You already did," I said before I could stop myself. We stood there in silence. Then, slowly, he reached out. Not aggressively. Not with certainty. Just an offering. I took his hand. No one spoke. We didn't move. We just stood there, hand in hand, two people caught in a space they hadn't planned to enter. Later, we returned to our separate rooms. I didn't sleep right away. I sat by the window, watching the glow of cars in the distance. I thought about the man sleeping at home, and the man whose hand I had just held. I thought about what it meant to want something you know you shouldn't. About how loneliness can feel even heavier when you're standing next to someone who sees you. The next morning, we checked out and drove back. He didn't say much. Neither did I. But everything had changed. Again. Coming back felt like returning from someplace secret. The trip hadn't ended in scandal or declarations. There were no grand gestures. Just small, irreversible shifts. I stepped into my home, suitcase in hand, and found my husband reading on the couch, feet up, glasses slipping slightly down his nose. He looked up and gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good trip?" he asked. "It went well," I replied, toeing off my shoes. They were pleased. He nodded, his attention already drifting back to the book. I stood there for a moment, waiting for something, maybe a hug, a kiss, a spark of interest, but it didn't come. Eventually, I walked into the kitchen, made tea, and stared out the window as the kettle hissed behind me. The silence felt louder than usual. I couldn't stop replaying that night in my head. The cold air. The look in his eyes. The quiet way he reached for my hand. And most of all, the way I hadn't pulled away. Back at the office, the pace picked up again. A new phase of the project required tighter coordination, more meetings, more hours. We slipped back into our professional rhythm, at least on the surface. But under that rhythm, a current pulled quietly between us. We didn't acknowledge it. We didn't have to. It was there. Then came the day he invited me to join him for a follow-up client meeting across town. Just the two of us. The calendar note was polite, the email brief. I agreed without hesitation. The meeting ran long. Afterwards, we stopped for a late lunch, something quick, just a sandwich shop near the venue. We sat in a quiet corner, surrounded by chatter we didn't participate in. We talked about work, of course, but the conversation wandered. Music, family, small regrets. He told me about his father, how he used to take him fishing. I told him about a summer trip I once took to Maine, how the air there smelled like pine and salt. It was during a pause, one of those soft spaces between words, that he looked at me and said, "I know this is complicated. I'm not asking for anything. I just think about you." I didn't answer. My throat tightened too quickly. But I didn't look away. The drive back to the office was silent. Not uncomfortable, just full. When we arrived, he parked the car and turned to me. Do you want to come by my office later? We still need to review the vendor proposal. I nodded, knowing that wasn't the real reason he'd asked. Later that evening, long after most people had gone home, I knocked on his door. He opened it slowly, gestured for me to come in. There were documents spread across his desk, a pen in his hand, but we both knew that wasn't what this was about. He stood by the window again. It had become his posture of vulnerability, I realized. When he didn't want to be seen but still wanted to speak. I don't want to be someone who causes damage, he said. But I also don't want to lie to myself. I sat down, hands folded in my lap. Neither do I said. He turned, studied me for a moment. I don't know what he was searching for, permission, maybe, or forgiveness. I won't pressure you, he said. I believed him. I stayed for another hour. We went over the proposal, exchanged thoughts, tried to focus. But our hands kept brushing when we passed pages. At one point, he leaned over to point something out, and I turned my head. Our faces were inches apart. We kissed. There was no hesitation this time. No apologies. No excuses. Just the quiet acknowledgement of something that had long been waiting. We kissed. When we broke apart, I didn't speak. Neither did he. We simply stood still, letting the moment settle around us like dust in sunlight. I left soon after. The night air was cool, and the streets mostly empty. I drove slowly, windows down, letting the breeze cut through the noise in my head. When I got home, the house was dark. My husband had gone to bed. I moved quietly, washed my face, changed into sleep clothes, and slipped under the covers beside him. He shifted in his sleep, mumbling something I couldn't catch. I watched the outline of his back, rising and falling, and felt the crushing weight of contrast. The man who had once made me feel seen now seemed like a ghost beside me, while the one I had kissed made the world feel vivid again. I didn't sleep much that night. Morning came too soon. I moved through it like muscle memory: shower, dress, coffee, keys. My husband kissed my cheek on the way out. I let him. At work, he didn't avoid me. He didn't speak to me more than usual either. But something in his eyes had changed. Something in mine had, too. We were no longer pretending. But we still weren't saying anything. And in that space between silence and confession, the line between right and wrong blurred even further. The days after that second kiss felt surreal in their quietness. Nothing had outwardly changed, emails still arrived by the hour, clients still needed updates, and the office moved forward in its usual rhythm, but I carried a different weight now. A knowing. A tremble beneath the surface of everything I did. We didn't speak of it. There was no debrief, no awkward apology. He returned to his routine, and so did I. But there was a subtle shift. His glances held longer. His pauses between sentences were slower, heavier. Every moment near him felt like walking across a frozen lake, aware that the ice could crack beneath me at any second. At home, I found myself more present, overly so, maybe. I cooked dinner 2 nights in a row. I asked my husband about his work, about the book he was reading, about anything at all. I clung to normalcy like a lifeline. He noticed, I think, though he didn't comment. He responded with more warmth than usual, reached for my hand once during a movie, even left a note in my lunch bag one morning. *, hope today's not too stressful. *. That made it worse. The guilt wasn't sharp. It was slow, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river. It built quietly with each gesture, each moment I couldn't reciprocate with honesty. Then came the message. It arrived one afternoon while I was reviewing contracts. Just a short sentence that popped up on my phone screen. Asterisk, we need to talk. Not at work. Asterisk. My stomach flipped. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. Asterisk, where? Asterisk. He suggested a small bar not far from the office, quiet, out of the way, a place where no one from work would likely appear. I agreed, though my fingers hesitated over the keys. That evening, I told my husband I had to stay late for reports. He didn't question it. Just nodded and said, "Don't forget your umbrella, they're saying it might rain." At the bar, he was already seated in a booth at the back, a glass of something untouched in front of him. He stood when I arrived, but didn't reach for me, didn't smile. I sat, my coat still on. We were both quiet for a while. The bar was dimly lit, music soft, the kind of place that invited confessions and regrets. "I didn't call you here for anything inappropriate," he said at last. "I just need clarity." I nodded but said nothing. "This isn't fair to you," he continued. "Or to me. Or anyone, really. But I also can't pretend it didn't happen. That it doesn't matter." He looked directly at me then, and I felt everything in me brace for impact. "I care about you," he said. "More than I should. I know that. And I'm not expecting anything. I just needed you to know." I felt the heat rise in my throat. I took a sip of water, though my mouth was already dry. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted. "I didn't plan this. I didn't look for it. I know. I have a life. A husband. Responsibilities. It wasn't supposed to be part of the story. I didn't plan it either." We sat in silence again, both of us staring at the table like it might offer answers. But it didn't. "I don't want to become the reason something breaks," he said. "But I also don't want to disappear without saying what I feel." "Don't disappear," I said before I could stop myself. He nodded slowly. "Okay." We didn't touch that night. We didn't linger. We walked out together, said goodbye with a quietness that felt heavier than any embrace could have. I drove home in the rain, windshield wipers slicing through water and guilt. When I walked in, my husband was on the couch, watching a documentary. He muted the TV when he saw me, asked if I'd eaten. I lied and said yes. He offered to heat something anyway, I declined. I told him I was just tired. He nodded. Upstairs, I peeled off my damp clothes and stood under the shower for a long time, letting the water scald my skin. I watched the steam curl around me and imagined it lifting everything I felt out of my body. It didn't. That night, I lay awake listening to his breathing beside me. I tried to imagine what would happen if he knew. If he ever found out. Not just about the kiss, but about how much space this other man had taken up in my mind, in my body, in the quiet corridors of my heart. I wondered which was worse, the act, or the feeling. The next day, I entered the office like nothing had happened. I focused on tasks, avoided his floor when I didn't need to be there, kept my replies short and efficient. But late in the afternoon, just before I was about to leave, a message popped up from him, *Thanks for meeting me last night. I meant what I said. I'll respect whatever you decide. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't care. But because I cared too much. And I still didn't know what I was going to do. I was barely halfway through my morning coffee when the notification blinked on my screen. It was from the shared calendar. He had scheduled another out-of-town client presentation. Just the two of us. I stared at the invite for a few seconds longer than I should have before clicking accept. My hand hovered over the mouse, my heart tight in my chest, not from surprise but from inevitability. This wasn't new anymore. This was a continuation. The days leading up to the trip moved like a quiet tide. My husband was preoccupied with a new project at work, and our conversations were brief, functional. He asked if I needed help packing, something he hadn't offered in years, and I told him I had it covered. He didn't insist. On the drive to the airport, I kept reminding myself this was a business trip. A responsibility. A necessity. I watched the landscape blur past the window and tried to focus on anything other than how my body already anticipated his presence before we'd even met at the terminal. We greeted each other with polite, professional smiles. On the plane, we sat next to each other but didn't speak much. The flight was short, but the silence between us stretched like an unwritten page. The hotel was sleek, anonymous, corporate. Separate rooms, different floors. Everything as it should be. The meeting went well. We presented with confidence, the client asked all the right questions, and by late afternoon, the deal was sealed. Our team would move forward. Success. That's what we had come here for, after all. That evening, there was a celebratory dinner. A few members of the client's team joined, but it was low-key, good food, soft music, polite laughter. We sat across from each other. Occasionally our eyes would meet, but we looked away quickly, like people trying not to touch a wound they knew hadn't healed. When the dinner ended and the others drifted away, he lingered behind. So did I. Neither of us spoke, but when we stepped outside into the night air, we walked in the same direction. The hotel loomed ahead, but instead of going in, we turned toward the back terrace, a small space with a view of the city skyline. There was a long bench and silence thick enough to sit in between us. We didn't sit immediately. We stood for a while, looking out, saying nothing. Then, finally, he spoke. "We shouldn't do this," he said, voice low. "But we already are." I nodded. There was no defense. Nothing to explain. He turned to face me. I looked at him fully, without deflecting. And we kissed. We spent the night together. There was no drama. No declarations. No tangled sheets or whispered confessions. Just two people stepping across a line they both knew they would eventually cross, no matter how long they'd spent standing near it. The next morning, I woke before him. For a few minutes, I just watched him sleep. His features softened in rest, the usual tension gone from his brow. He looked younger, gentler, someone separate from the man I worked beside every day. A different version of the same person. I slid quietly out of bed, dressed quickly, and left the room without waking him. The hallway was cold and empty, the carpet muffling my steps. In the elevator, I checked my reflection, hair a little wild, eyes rimmed with tiredness, lips still slightly swollen from sleep and something more. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. Not crying. Not shaking. Just still. The weight of it all was suddenly so real. The consequences. The contradictions. The impossible calculus of wanting two lives to exist in the same space. I showered slowly, carefully, as if rinsing away not just the scent of him but the knowledge of what I'd done. My skin was pink from the heat by the time I stepped out. I dressed in silence, applying makeup with the precision of someone desperate to restore control. When we met in the lobby an hour later to check out, we didn't say anything personal. He looked at me briefly, nodded once, and we boarded the car back to the airport. On the plane, we sat apart. I watched clouds drift by the window, feeling the distance not just between us but between the version of myself I had been and the one I was now. They were no longer the same. Not even close. When I got home, my husband met me at the door. He took my bag, kissed my cheek. He had cooked something simple: pasta, salad, wine. I thanked him, smiled. We sat across from each other, and for a moment I thought he might say something. Ask something. But he didn't. How was it? He asked. Good, I replied. Tiring. I'm glad it went well. I nodded and took another bite. That night, we lay in bed in our usual positions, him on his side, already drifting, and me on my back, staring at the ceiling. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. And I didn't know if I wanted to find my way back. The days after our return blurred into each other, one indistinguishable from the next, but under their surface ran a current that pulled at everything familiar. I went through the motions at home, cooking, folding laundry, listening to updates about my husband's work, but I wasn't really there. I was functioning, not living. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, but chose not to ask. Either way, I found myself resenting the silence between us more than any argument we could have had. At least a fight would have meant he cared enough to engage. At the office, everything became more precise. We spoke when necessary, worked side by side when required, but kept a careful distance. If anyone noticed a change, they didn't say. We were both professionals. Efficient. Composed. But something in him had shifted too. He no longer lingered near my desk, no longer looked for excuses to catch my eye. He stopped sending after-hours messages, stopped finding reasons for small meetings. If I didn't know better, I would have thought he was pulling away. But it wasn't that. It felt more like retreat. Like he was trying to manage something inside himself, or protect something inside me. That hurt more than I expected. And it confused me. Because I had told myself I didn't want more. I had sworn to myself this wouldn't become anything messy or demanding. It was supposed to be a moment, an interruption, a detour, nothing lasting. But now that he was stepping back, I felt the absence in ways I couldn't articulate. It made me question everything. My marriage. My choices. Even my reasons for staying silent. One night, I sat in bed long after my husband had fallen asleep, scrolling through old messages on my phone. I didn't know what I was looking for. Reassurance? Clarity? Closure? I read and reread his words, searching for something definitive that would tell me what to do, how to move forward, but of course, there was nothing. Eventually, I closed the screen and lay back, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight with a kind of ache I hadn't known existed until now. A week later, the silence broke, not between him and me, but between me and the reality I'd been trying to outrun. It was a Friday. I came home to find my husband in the living room, laptop open on the coffee table. He was staring at the screen with a strange expression, somewhere between confusion and disbelief. At first, I thought it was something work-related. I asked if everything was okay. He didn't answer. He just turned the laptop slightly toward me. And there it was. A message thread. Our message thread. Not everything. Just enough. A few lines that didn't explicitly confess, but implied more than I could explain away. The language wasn't obvious, but the tone was unmistakable. My heart stopped. I synced your phone a while back, he said finally, his voice flat. Forgot about it. Then I noticed the backup files. I opened them today. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't cry. That made it worse. I stood there, rooted in place, blood roaring in my ears. My mouth opened, but no words came. What could I say? That it didn't mean anything? That it was complicated? That I didn't intend for it to happen? He sat back and looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize. Not angry. Not even betrayed. Just emptied out. I don't even know what to ask, he said. I don't know if there's more. I don't think I want to know. I tried to speak, but he held up a hand. I just need space, he said. To think. And with that, he stood, grabbed his keys, and left. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like a gunshot. I sat down on the edge of the couch and stared at the screen. The words looked foreign now, ridiculous in their subtle intimacy. I closed the laptop slowly, as if that might somehow undo what had been done. But it was too late. The line we had crossed in a hotel room miles from here had followed me home, slipped into my quiet kitchen, my familiar bed, and now, it had cracked everything open. For hours, I didn't move. I watched the light change across the walls as the sun sank and the evening darkened. At some point, I realized I hadn't eaten. I hadn't cried either. I didn't feel numb. I felt exposed. Raw. Eventually, I got up, walked to the sink, and poured myself a glass of water. My hands trembled slightly, but I managed not to spill. That night, I slept on the couch. Not because I had to. Because I couldn't bear the thought of lying in the bed we had shared, knowing he had read those words. Knowing he had seen a part of me that I had tried so carefully to hide, even from myself. The next morning, the house was quiet. He hadn't come back. The silence in the house that morning felt like another presence, thick and expectant. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt suspended, like everything was holding its breath. I moved through the kitchen slowly, almost cautiously, as if trying not to disturb something delicate. The sunlight filtering through the blinds made patterns on the floor I didn't recognize, even though I must have seen them every morning for years. His keys were gone. The coat he usually threw over the dining chair was missing. No note. No call. Just absence. I made coffee, though I barely tasted it. I sat at the table with the mug in my hands, letting the steam fog my glasses. I didn't check my phone. I didn't want to see if he had messaged me. I wasn't ready. Eventually, I showered, dressed, and drove to work. The streets looked the same, but I felt like I was moving through a different version of the city. Like the colors had faded slightly. At the office, I was early. The lights in the hallway hadn't even been turned on yet. I walked past familiar desks and paused briefly before entering mine. Everything was where I left it, yet it felt foreign. Unmoored. I kept my head down and buried myself in numbers, graphs, revisions, anything that would occupy my hands and leave no space for thought. But even that couldn't stop the pounding inside me, the sharp edge of waiting. Around midday, I saw him. He was walking down the corridor with two other department leads, discussing something technical. He didn't glance at me. Didn't even hesitate. Just kept walking, speaking in his usual composed tone. And that was when I felt it. A strange mix of grief and clarity. Because while everything in my personal life was unraveling, he had already begun to retreat from what had started between us. Maybe he had to. Maybe that was the only way either of us could continue functioning in this place without falling apart. Still, a part of me resented how easily he seemed to compartmentalize, to continue on as if nothing had happened. I knew better, of course. I knew his silence was its own kind of noise. But it didn't make it easier. By the end of the day, I still hadn't heard from my husband. I didn't even know where he had gone. I called once, around 7. It rang and went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. When I walked into the house that night, everything was just as I'd left it. His shoes were still missing. His toothbrush wasn't in its place. I sat on the couch, legs tucked beneath me, and waited for a knock, a call, a sign of anything. Nothing came. I stared at the framed photos on the wall. Us on vacation. Him at a friend's wedding. A smiling version of me I didn't quite recognize anymore. The woman in those pictures had clarity, or at least she thought she did. She knew her roles, her routines. She believed in the structure of her life. I no longer did. Later that night, I received an email. Not from my husband. From him. It was short. Just 2 lines. Asterisk I heard. I'm sorry. I didn't want this for you. Asterisk. No name. No subject line. Just those words. I read them again and again. I didn't respond. Because what could I say? I closed my laptop and walked into the bathroom, where I stared at my own reflection for longer than I ever had before. There were lines on my face I hadn't noticed, a hollowness around my eyes. But there was also something else, a kind of stillness. Not numbness. Resolve. The next morning, I didn't rush. I moved slowly, deliberately. I picked out a dark blouse, something simple. I didn't apply makeup. I didn't style my hair. I let it fall naturally, the way it used to before I started trying again. I called into work and said I wouldn't be coming in. No explanation. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not to him. To my husband. It wasn't an apology, exactly. It was a confession. Not of the details, but of the truths. That I had drifted. That I had felt invisible. That I hadn't spoken soon enough, hadn't asked for more, hadn't known how to fix what had quietly broken between us. I wrote that I didn't blame him. That maybe we had both settled into comfort too deeply, forgetting that intimacy requires more than time shared in a room. I told him I still cared for him. But I wasn't sure that was enough. And I ended it with this. Asterisk if you come back, I'll be here. Not with excuses. But with truth. And if you choose not to, I will understand. Either way, I want us both to stop pretending. Asterisk. I left the letter on the table, folded neatly. Then I sat in the living room, watching the door, not knowing whether to hope it would open or stay closed forever. The day passed in a haze, each hour marked only by the way light shifted through the living room window. Sometimes I stood and paced, sometimes I sat so still my limbs ached, but mostly I just listened to the sounds of the house. The hum of the refrigerator. The distant traffic outside. The creak of wood settling. Every little noise felt significant, as if the universe was preparing me for a verdict I couldn't predict. I checked my phone occasionally, though I wasn't sure what I expected. No missed calls, no new messages, not from my husband, not from him. The world had fallen silent around me, leaving only my thoughts to fill the space. They crowded in, raw and insistent. I replayed everything, not just the last few weeks but years, decisions I'd made and conversations I'd avoided, moments when I'd chosen comfort over courage. I realized how easy it was to drift, to let inertia guide a marriage, to stop noticing the small distances growing day by day. In the late afternoon, I went for a walk. The sky was heavy with clouds but held back its rain, as if even the weather was waiting. I wandered familiar streets, seeing them with new eyes, noticing how neighbors' lives carried on to kids on bikes, an elderly man tending his roses, a couple arguing quietly near their car. Ordinary scenes, but each one felt like a reminder, life continues, no matter how personal your crisis feels. I stopped at a small cafe, ordered tea, and sat by the window. The world outside looked ordinary, but I felt changed, stripped down to something more honest. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what would come next if the door to my old life stayed closed. Could I start again? Was I brave enough to be alone? When I returned home, dusk was already pressing against the windows. The living room was washed in blue light, the silence deepened by evening. I stood in the kitchen, fingers tracing the folded letter I'd left for my husband. I felt exposed, but lighter than I had in weeks. The burden of secrecy was gone, replaced by an anxious anticipation for truth, whatever shape it took. Around 8, I heard the key in the lock. My breath caught. The door opened, slowly, as if he wasn't sure he wanted to enter. He stepped inside, looked at me, tired, worn, carrying his sadness plainly. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he saw the letter, picked it up, read it at the kitchen counter in silence. I stood a few steps away, heart pounding, unable to read his face. He finished reading, set the letter down, and looked at me. His voice was quiet. "I needed to know if you'd tell me the truth." "I'm sorry," I said, the words thin but real. I should have long before this." He nodded. "I know I've been absent. I know I made it easy for us to drift." I didn't correct him. We both knew the drift had been mutual. He sat at the table, head in his hands for a moment, then looked up. "Do you want to try? To fix it?" The question wasn't angry or desperate. It was honest. I searched myself for an answer. I didn't want to offer hope I couldn't fulfill, or stay out of guilt. "I don't know," I said. "I want to. But I can't promise." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "That's honest. I can work with honest." We sat there, not as lovers, not even as partners, just as two people who had shared a life and now had to decide what to do with the pieces. That night, we didn't talk much more. He slept in the guest room. I lay awake, feeling the strange comfort of truth, however uncertain the future. The next morning, I made coffee for both of us. We sat at the table, sipping in silence, the air between us clearer than it had been in years. Days became weeks. We talked. We listened. Sometimes we argued. Sometimes we simply existed in the same space, learning how to be honest, even when honesty hurt. He didn't ask about the other man, not directly. He didn't need to. That chapter was closed by necessity, not by choice. I deleted the messages, blocked the number, not as a gesture to my husband, but as a way to clear space in myself. Work continued, quieter now. My boss kept his distance, and I let him. We were civil, professional. The air between us no longer electric, just empty. In time, my husband and I found small ways to rebuild. A walk after dinner. A shared laugh at an old movie. The simple, patient effort of seeing each other again, for who we were now, not for who we used to be. Not everything healed. Not every day felt hopeful. But the sense of living in someone else's story faded. I felt present again, if only for moments at a time. One evening, months later, I walked the same neighborhood route alone. The air was gentle, the world green with spring. I thought of everything that had changed, everything that remained, and realized I was no longer afraid of the silence. I went home, turned on the lights, and poured myself a glass of wine. I opened the windows and let the evening breeze drift through the house, carrying with it the old air, the secrets, the pain. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe.